Close your eyes and dream of the Golden Age. Knights in shining armor, noble ladies, and the romance of the throne. Wake up. You're not a knight. You're a peasant, and you're suffocating. Do you smell that? That's the stench of your own home. You don't sleep alone. You're huddled in the dark with your livestock. You breathe their filth. You eat where they shah. And you pray the plague doesn't find you by morning. Water is a luxury. Soap is a myth. In this world, the dirt on your skin is the only thing keeping you warm. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where survival was a miracle and hygiene was a death sentence. Forget everything you know about comfort. Compared to our pampered modern lives, medieval hygiene wasn't just primitive. It was a brutal daily war for survival. But don't get it twisted. They didn't want to be filthy. They just didn't have a choice. Imagine a world with no plumbing, no shampoo, and no escape. For a peasant, even a second set of clothes was a luxury they'd never touched. While the elites lounged in steaming tubs and the middle class gossiped in public bathhouses, peasants were left with nothing but grit and cold water. Imagine this: no pipes, no faucets, no mercy. If you wanted to wash, you had to haul every single drop from a well or a river, lugging heavy buckets until your back snapped. Most baths were just a few inches of freezing, stagnant water in a wooden bowl. If your hut was too cramped, you stripped naked in the mud outside, shivering under the cold sky. You scrubbed your skin not for comfort, but to scrape off the crust of sweat and kill the lice that were eating you alive. Soap? Forget the lavender-scented bars you know. If you were lucky, you'd get a caustic, burning mixture of salt and lime that scorched your pores. It was brutal. It was exhausting. And for many, the math was simple. Why waste hours of back-breaking labor just to be clean for 10 minutes? They looked at the water, looked at their filth, and chose to stay dirty. While members of the upper class could afford hot water tubs and the middle class used public bathhouses, peasants had to make do with much less. Since there was no running water and they had to manually carry it from wells or rivers to their homes, bathing required a tremendous amount of effort. They had to wash in small amounts of water, which was often unheated. Those who didn't have a suitable space inside their homes bathed outdoors. Because peasants engaged in hard physical labor all day, bathing helped wash away the dirt and the smell of sweat, as well as get rid of lice and fleas. They didn't always use soap, but when they had the chance, they used a lye-based soap, for example, made from a mixture of ash and lime. However, since bathing was such a labor-intensive process, some peasants simply decided not to wash at all. People living in castles used toilets that looked like wooden benches with a hole, positioned directly over a cesspit. Peasants didn't have such a luxury. Instead, the lower classes used outhouses, which they often had to share with others. Those who didn't have access to an outhouse used chamber pots. If they couldn't afford even that, they simply used slop buckets. People would then empty their pots and buckets into nearby cesspools or rivers. Instead of toilet paper, they used straw, grass, moss, or hay. Before the advent of modern sanitation, some people believed that diseases were caused by the bad smell of the waste, rather than the waste itself. Historians note that to get rid of the stench indoors, some people would throw the contents of their pots out the window, right onto the street. However, dumping chamber pots out of windows, as well as relieving oneself in public places, was generally frowned upon by society. Peasants rarely suffered from cavities, but their teeth wore down quickly due to eating stone-ground bread. If a peasant had poor oral hygiene and developed dental problems, the tooth was most likely just pulled out. Instead of dentists, barbers performed most of the dental work. Since anesthesia was unavailable, patients would get heavily drunk before having their teeth treated. In the Middle Ages, peasant women bore the entire burden of managing the household. In addition to cooking, milking cows, and tending the garden, their daily or weekly chores could include churning butter, baking bread, and grinding grain. The expectations of the time also made women responsible for keeping the house clean and caring for their husbands' clothes. It was also their duty to rid their bedrooms and beds of fleas. Advice books from that era suggested using white bed sheets so that insects and parasites could be easily spotted. Some women scattered alder leaves around the room to keep pests away. And since towns expected residents to keep the areas outside their homes clean, women most likely took on this grueling task as well. Lacking education and even the chance to learn, peasants remained deeply superstitious for centuries. As the influence of the church grew, people increasingly turned to prayer in hopes of curing their ailments. Eventually, education began to spread across Europe, and new knowledge in science and medicine helped doctors become more skilled. The diet of medieval peasants consisted mostly of what they could grow on their own plots: beans, grains, vegetables, and onions. Depending on how close a peasant lived to a cesspit or a contaminated water source, the soil used for growing crops and the water used for cooking could easily be tainted with human or animal waste. Without refrigeration, fresh vegetables were completely unavailable in the winter, while stored grain and root vegetables often rotted or became infested with pests. Furthermore, the grain could be poisoned by toxic fungus. If people weren't careful, they would suffer from severe indigestion, diarrhea, or other illnesses caused by spoiled food. As for meat, it was a luxury that many peasants simply couldn't afford. Sometimes people used smoke and steam to get rid of so-called toothworms and mites. They burned chamomile seeds and inhaled the smoke, or held infected body parts over it to get rid of earworms, completely non-existent parasites. Doctors would pour medicines made from the bitterest herbs into people's ears. They also used these bitter herbs to destroy parasites in other parts of the body. However, such herbs caused terrible diarrhea. Medieval people even suffered from toxic medicines containing heavy minerals like mercury. If a patient vomited or suffered from painful bowel movements, doctors interpreted this as a sign that the body was purging parasites and starting to heal. So that was the harsh reality of medieval peasant hygiene. Well, that's all for today. Subscribe to the channel, be sure to hit that like button, and leave a comment below.